Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final event in the Biologist Talks Perspectives on the Gut series. I'm Sofia Sandagli. I'm a PhD student in infection biology here at the University of Glasgow, and I will be one of the chairs for this evening. Thank you very much for joining us, both in person and online. We once again have an exciting and varied panel of speakers that we will shortly be introducing to. But before we do, I'll say a few words of introduction to the event as a whole, as I usually do. So Violet Talks is a collaborative project between students in the life sciences and humanities here at the University of Glasgow. We host events in which we bring together scientists, literary academics, and artists, but also historians and other academics involved in the humanities. And in these discussions, we share our perspectives on a common theme. So in the past, we've run events exploring infectious diseases, exploring the role of languages, and in November, we launched the Perspectives on the Gut series. And so far, we've talked about the gut microbiome, we've talked about the gut-brain axis, and the culture existing behind food production and consumption. Today, we're once again approaching the topic of diet, but we're doing so from a bit of a different angle. We are particularly interested in understanding nutrition and its relationship with disease, well-being, and aging. So there's been a lot of interest in recent years on the role of the gut microbiome and how diet can influence the gut microbiome, and consequently how this can influence whole organismal health. It's a fascinating topic. It's a topic that's getting a lot of attention these days, but it's also not a new topic. So even in the past, we had an understanding of digestive health and how it could be connected to gastronomy and overall well-being. And there was a particular high point for this in the 19th century, which, given the expertise of our speakers, is something we will be touching on today, alongside a modern. So I'm very much looking forward to it, and I would now like to pass it over to Michael Beelwater, who's a doctoral student in creative writing here at the University of Glasgow, and he will be one of the co-chairs for tonight.
Thanks, Sophia. Hello, everyone. For those of you who haven't attended one of our talks before, just want to quickly run you through the format. We are a hybrid event, so as well as you guys in the room, we've got everyone online. Hello. And the event's being recorded for later broadcast online. So I would ask that everyone in the room turn your phones off if you can, and everyone online make sure that you're on mute. This evening, we're going to start with a discussion on our topic, leaving time at the end for questions, and afterwards there will be drinks and nibbles for those of you who can hang around for further questions and discussion. Also, if you have time, we'd appreciate it if you could fill out the questionnaires, which would either be on your chairs if you're in the room, or if you're online, it should pop up when you're about to leave the Zoom call. So, now let's introduce our speakers. Tonight we have with us Dr. Emilie Taylor-Pirie, a historian of science and culture specializing in medical humanities, who's currently Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow in the Department of English Literature at the University of Birmingham. We have Dr. Adam Dobson, the UK Research Institute Future Leadership Fellow in Molecular Biosciences at the University of Glasgow. He's currently looking for evolutionarily conserved ways that bacteria communicate with their hosts and how that impacts long-term health. We also have Dr. Elsa Richardson, a historian of health based at the University of Strathclyde, where she holds a Chancellor's Fellowship. She recently spent 6 months at Berlin Max Planck Center for the History of Emotion, working on a project exploring the history of the gut-brain connection. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful to have you here. I wonder if we could start hearing from each of you a little bit about your perspective on this contemporary relationship between diet and health as we see it today. Be good to kind of ground ourselves in your current thinking of where we stand and a little bit of how we're starting to put that into context.
Well, I'll just begin by telling you a little bit more about who I am and what I do, and hopefully those things will happen organically. So I work in a field called the medical humanities, which is interested in how humanities subjects like history, literature, and cultural studies can help to kind of enrich and deepen our understanding of medicine, of the doctor-patient relationship, of the relationship between evidence and knowledge, and ultimately this dynamic relationship we have between science and society. So between 2016 and 2019, I was part of a big grant-funded project at the University of Oxford called the Diseases of Modern Life, 19th century perspectives. And that project investigated how the Victorians experienced diseases associated with modernity. So these were diseases associated with living in cities, commuting to work, longer working hours, stress, strain, burnout, that kind of thing. And perhaps unsurprisingly, my expertise was in gut health. So this was a century that saw huge changes in the way that people ate, what they ate, where they ate, when they ate, how much they ate, and who they ate with. It saw the development of the science of nutrition, the rise of the calorie, the pathologization of fatness, London's first vegetarian restaurants, huge expansions in local and national food regulations amid adulteration scandals. We'll speak the banger anyone. And you have this real recognition of the importance of this connection between the gut and the brain. Towards the end of the century, you even have a nascent recognition of the importance of so-called good bacteria. So what I was interested in is tracing this kind of rich prehistory to what we think of as a very modern medical and cultural moment.
And we work kind of in pretty similar fields, maybe from slightly different perspectives. So I work on the history of health, and I'm particularly interested in all things digestion. So currently we're working on a book about the long history of the gut-brain connection, a book which was sparked, I guess, maybe in the same way that many books are sparked. It was sparked by irritation. So, so I was reading an article in The Guardian, one of many articles in The Guardian that are published about new research into the gut, which suggests that I think this particular article was about new medical research, which suggested that the gut, which had shown rather the gut was a major producer of serotonin. And the article went on to postulate that then perhaps eating right and eating better might allow us to all become happier individuals. And this irked me for a number of reasons. One, I guess as a historian of health, I was irked because of this prehistory and perhaps being aware that this was not particularly new knowledge, and rather it had a much a longer life, let's say. And also, as someone who works in the history of emotions, I was irked by the fact that happiness, being linked to serotonin in the gut in this way, figured happiness as something which is universal, which is trans-historical, which is not shaped by any kind of cultural peculiarities, rather than something which is held within culture and held within a historical moment. So I was annoyed in a number of ways. And I guess that what annoyed me most was that I wondered whether, and this is no offense to the one scientist, but whether or not biomedicine had only one particular kind of story to tell about things between the mind and the gut, and that perhaps there were kind of more interesting, messier, more kind of culturally rich ways that we can think about the gut in relation to health. And one historian who I've kind of turned to often is the American historian of health, Frederick Kaufman, has this term which I love called gastropolitics. And the way that he describes gastropolitics is this idea that all of our understandings, or many of our understandings of virtue and vice, of what we privilege and what we don't privilege, of what we see as good and what we see as bad, are shaped by what we eat, how we digest, and the politics of identification.
So I am a nutritional biologist, non-historian of the group. So what that means is that I'm interested in the fundamental processes by which what we eat and the bacteria that live in our gut determine our health in a very broad sense. And this, I think the recent history of nutrition in biosciences has been that the more we know, the less we understand. And a realization that some of these maxims that what is a good diet are very context dependent, and many of them don't hold. Don't sound scrutiny, but really showing all the time that we don't really know what a good diet actually is. Many of the things that we thought we knew what one should do probably don't hold, and it's rather complicated. What is good for one person might be very different to what is good for a different person. What is good for a certain trait might be not good for a different trait. So, for example, I'm very interested in aging, how we can use diet to promote healthier lifestyle. We know that people are already living longer. This changes the public health, changes medicine. That's not necessarily coupled to a change in well-being. As people age, we have this increased burden of disease. So I'm interested in how we might be able to target what we eat, target the bacteria that live in our gut, to promote healthier aging. The tricky thing about this is that in animal systems, we see that things that you do that seem to promote health in late life are bad for you in early life, or at least less good for you in early life. Generally, the things that people want to eat, things that they want to do, are generally not good for the way people age. And so I'm interested in how you can figure out what is good about a given intervention, what's bad about it, and can you break that? Can you use that to promote longer? Well, can you use that to promote the length, the healthy period of life?
What's interesting about that is that it's also contextual, right? All three of you have come here from lines of research that require this interdisciplinarity from the start. What do you think are the key contexts that are dictating our contemporary views on diet and health? Like, what do we think is a good diet, and what do we think is the goal of health now, and how is that challenged and challenging in research?
That's a really good question. I mean, I guess as a historian, I think I want to draw sometimes fairly facile connections between the 19th century and the present, but sometimes I feel like I can't ignore them. And I feel like so part of my research looks at kind of popular health reformers in the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. So I look at the type of people who might write kind of early self-help books, which often contain a good deal of dietary advice, which are actually usually structured around dietary advice. And from that context in the 19th and early 20th century, there is this kind of growing focus, growing obsession with the idea of a kind of dietary purity. So this idea that, that it is possible, beneficial and optimal to aim for this kind of ideal of a pure diet. So a lot of this comes out of, some of this rather, comes out of the kind of 19th century vegetarian, which is one of my main areas of interest, in which this idea of purity is linked to, I guess, a kind of idea of, well, Eden, really. It's about kind of finding a way of kind of prelapsarian diet, a way to get back to the kind of natural diet of man. And what's interesting in relation to nutrition is that by the time it gets to the kind of late 19th and early 20th century, those ideas, which previously had been fairly kind of religiously coded, become newly imagined through this language of nutrition, through this emerging language of nutritional science. And I guess the kind of link that I see from those dietary reformers in the late 19th and early 20th century and today is this kind of, I think, a really kind of tricky, quite problematic idea about the pure body, which I think manifests often now in a kind of popular well-being culture, which is preoccupied by the idea of toxins and ridding the body of toxins. And that's the kind of, I think in both cases, you see this imaginary of the ideal body as one which is the clean, the pure, the kind of unpolluted body. And yeah, I wonder if you guys have similar thoughts.
So I'm curious that you see a connection I wasn't aware of between dietary purity and eating and religion. And I often find that those who are in the present day advocating a given diet or given lifestyle can be quite evangelical about it. And do you think that that might stem directly from past history, or is that just something which is innate to our relationship with our food?
Really good question. I feel like, I mean, I get to clarify the point about the kind of prelapsarian and Edenic diet. What recent vegetarian reformers from the middle part of the 19th century are looking back to this idea of the Garden of Eden as kind of serving a model for the ideal everyday diet is because it's, because Adam and Eve don't eat meat, do not eat the animals until after the fall. So there's this idea that, to return to a meatless diet is to return to a diet which is more godly, which will bring you in closer spiritual communion, which is not corrupted, right? So I think that perhaps the kind of line there to be drawn is around this idea of the corrupted self, right? There are certain substances once consumed that corrupt the body and the soul and the spirit. In terms of the kind of evangelical, I mean, 19th century vegetarians were very evangelical, and we're out to convert others to their cause, and we're massively successful in doing so. I mean, I guess that there were meat-free diets before the 19th century, obviously, and meat eaters before the 19th century. But the middle of the Victorian period is really where you see the formation of, in a very Victorian fashion, societies, associations, all of which were completely dedicated to converting as many people as we could to their cause.
I mean, I think another reason that it's often evangelical is for the pure sense of selling products, right? So, a huge part of the wellness industry is Instagram and detox teas is what I was thinking of, and various pills and whatever that you can take to, it's not even just about losing weight anymore, which I think is something that's quite interesting. It's also about gaining some kind of emotional completeness. And it just makes me think about the fact that this is completely continuous within the 19th century. You have this huge explosion of print culture, and along with that, you have adverts for everything from dietetic bread to special jelly to magic panacea-like pills that are going to cure you of all your ills. So I think this is, part of the evangelicalism is part of the fact that diets, a huge component of diet is commercial. And ideological, right, as well, I think.
Sure. So I find this idea of purity very curious concept of something. There's a kind of dichotomous view of
Sorry, can you speak up just a little bit?
Sure. So I find this idea of purity and the history of purity of one's diet very interesting, because I think we tend to see this. That there's a general view that toxins are dichotomous, and that this thing is bad and that thing is good. Anything could be a toxin. Drinking enough water, that will kill you. It's defined in purely scientific terms as just something that causes you harm, and enough of anything can cause you harm. Very, 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 very low levels of certain things that are very poisonous, won't kill you. So there's not really it's a lot kind of more squidgy than we like to think.
I'm also interested though, it is. Yes, because it's a good term.
Also, what's bad for one person is not going to be the same as what's bad for somebody else.
Right, and I think this is also something that emerges alongside these other discourses in the 19th century. I know this is my special subject. Everything happens in the 19th century. But you do get, which I think is an often overlooked thing in history as well, is you get this nascent recognition of allergies and food intolerance starting in the middle of the 19th century. And what comes with that is a recognition of the idiosyncrasies of the gut, and the sense that the universal, the kind of like desire for a universal diet doesn't work very well. And you have people writing into these periodicals, family protocols, domestic health manuals, with their own like just self experiments. People write in and say, I decided to give up cheese for a month. This is what happened. I decided, and the British Medical Journal and the Lancet would investigate things like, is coffee a food? Can you survive on coffee? Is alcohol good for you? So these are kinds of questions that are really being kind of played out. And what I think is quite interesting is in the 20th century, we sort of almost lose that again, that space for nuance within diet, that we're hopefully, I think, regaining this sense that that everyone's digestive systems are actually incredibly different.
Adam, what your comment about when you give a summary of the research you're carrying out at the moment around aging, thing immediately pops into my head was Thomas Cogan's Haven of Health, which is this book from some, again, early modernist, going to correct me here, but I think it's from around the 1600s. And it's a kind of one of the first dietetic manuals. Basically, all it is kind of a list of anything you could imagine eating at all. So from like beef to dandelion, anything you might possibly consume. And what he does is he gives the kind of properties of that thing that you're eating, and also a kind of recommendation as to who should eat it, in what quantities, whether it should be cooked, whether it should be raw, and all of this is based around a humoral understanding of the body, which is absolutely concerned with age. So one of the kind of key, considerations that he includes is the age of the eater, right? So, for example, men over the age of elderly men should avoid eating ram lest they become more ramish, right? So there's this idea that, like, you know, that when considering what to eat, like the age is a key component. And I think that you're absolutely right, Emily, that really the part of what we're losing or what we have lost in the 20th century is this idea of, I guess, a kind of the person as a system, not a system, the person as holistic in some way.
Are we seeing like a simultaneous shift in the sciences readdressing that? Because it's clear that there's been this social drift that's kind of calcified in the 20th century, and that we're now interested in reinvestigating the humanities and the arts. But is science research funding moving that way too? And are you seeing trends in science that are evolving on this path?
Yeah, this is a really interesting point actually. But where to start with this? So there's been a huge technological revolution really in the past 20 to 30 years in the way that we do biology. We have all of a sudden been able to, we've had this concept of a gene for a long time, since 1911 or so. And that has lent itself to a very kind of reductionist view of the way that biological systems function, because that gave us a unit of a thing that we could study.
Sorry, we'll be asked about the
Okay.
microphone.
I hope this works.
It does.
I have a bad history with this microphone. I found myself a few weeks ago stalking up and down this room shouting so that people at each end could hear. Hopefully it works better today. So yeah, the concept of the gene gave us a really kind of helpful reductionist view because it was a unit of something you could study. And especially when we were able to manipulate these things, you know, we could make mutants. We could say, okay, so it looks like this gene is involved in this thing. You know, so this is what's called kind of Mendelian genetics, where you have a single genetic locus of the genome that determines the color of the flower. Then we realized that things are more complicated because actually you have multiple genes which affect adder, and some of them interact. So maybe you get an exponential effect of two of them, where you know the sum of their parts is greater than, so the output is greater than the sum of their parts. Or other genes kind of interact and cancel the effect of each other out. And this kind of development and understanding has been kind of coupled to a recognition, well, not really recognition, but almost kind of remembering that biological systems are very, very complicated networks of molecules. You have DNA, which is just a code, and then there are things that regulate the way that is expressed. And then they are expressed like RNA, and then RNA is turned into proteins, and then some proteins modify the function of other proteins, and then those proteins determine the way that you use metabolites, and then the way that you use those metabolites determines the way that the cell works, and then those cells all fit together, and then they form tissues. And it all gets obviously mind-bogglingly complicated. And so the idea that we can study the complexity of something which is as fundamental to the way that every single cell on this planet works, nutrition, in terms of binary switches at the level of genes, is patently wrong, but it's been the way that we've done biology now for 100 years. And so I think there is an increasing recognition now that we have the technologies where we can go out, we can measure all of these complexities at the same time. For example, we can measure the way that different genes are expressed throughout the genome. That has fostered a return to more complex ways of thinking about these problems. We're not all the way there yet, and there's still a lot of recalcitrance because it's nice and easy to knock out a certain gene, know that it's living longer, or it's dead or whatever. And indeed we do this in my lab as well. But I think you need to couple this to a much more kind of sophisticated view of the multi-dimensionality of the way that organisms function. And it's a long road, it's a very difficult thing to do, but we're not going to be able to achieve what I see as kind of the ultimate goal of this, which is to predict for a certain individual what a good dietary recommendation might be, unless we can start to embrace this complexity. Pass the microphone to someone.
So one of the things that I'm interested in history of medicine is sort of this idea that there have been pivotal moments after which perhaps a scientific discovery was made, or a new hypothesis was formulated. And after that, there was not only a change in science, but also a change in social behaviors. And I'm particularly interested in what could be these pivotal moments in sort of the history of nutrition. When have they come about? Which ones have they been, and how have they influenced science today?
Okay.
There's loads. I'm going to choose the vitamin. I think the discovery of vitamins in the early part of the 20th century is pretty essential. And I think I choose the discovery and synthesis of vitamins because I think it fits the model that you described. In that I think it does something to the science of nutrition, something a fundamental shift in the way that nutritionists think about the body. So this move away with the discovery, I guess, was it the vitamin B first? I was confused by that. I think it's vitamin B first, then A, then C. I think that it does something fundamental to the way that the science of nutrition is configured. So a move away from, I guess, a focus on carbohydrates, proteins, calories, and to a much greater emphasis on well, vitamins, vitamin diseases that are the result of vitamin deficiency, and so on. But also, I think, to my mind, what's probably more interesting is the way that it also helps to shift, I guess, the way that ordinary non-specialists think about their body and think about diet. So one of the ways that it does this is that I think it introduces a kind of different popular understanding of the body. So perhaps a move away from a kind of 19th century, late 19th century model of the body as machine, right? So where you have calorie input and output, where you have kind of, protein and levels of where you measure protein and carbohydrate in relation, for example, to the kind of work you do, right? So if you're a manual laborer, you need more of these calories, and towards this, I think a really different understanding of the body that's formulated around vitamins. And one of the things that I think it does is it allows diet to be something that the diet can be both plenty can be deficient. So this idea that, even if you have lots and lots of food and you have enough to eat, that can still be, that the food itself can not be deficient. It's not just about mass and quantity anymore. There's something like particular. And I guess in relation to your work, I guess around kind of diseases of modern life and modernity is acting particular kinds of violence in the body. I feel like the vitamin becomes a kind of locus around which anxieties around modernization and modernity formulate. So thinking about kind of fears about kind of mass-produced food as being vitamin deficient, or fears around kind of the modern diet as being particularly bad for you. Yeah, I pumped for the vitamin. Okay, I have something else to say about it. I forgot it. I'll come back.
Good choice, good choice. I'm going to probably flip the question slightly to my own ends. Because one of the things that you were talking about, or one of the things that it makes me think of when we think about modern life is the relationship between diet and stress, which is something that I think now is very current, feels very current, but was also something that was a big talking point in the 19th century, and I kind of got lost in the intervening years a little bit, or became deprioritized for one reason or another. So I had some props with me that I was going to bring, and then ceremoniously left them in my hotel room. One of them was a huge oversized stomach. And one of them was what's called a domestic health manual, which is kind of like an advice manual you'd have in your home for all kinds of queries you'd have about your family's health. And one of the things that emerges or continues to be current alongside this recognition of proteins and carbohydrates and the makeup of nutrition is a sense of the importance of time with digestion, a timely digestion, what I call gastric time.
So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story of Alexis St. Martin. No? Okay, great. I love telling the story. So there was a Canadian man called Alexis St. Martin, who in about 1822 was shot at close range with a musket. And the bullet tore through his abdomen, punctured a lung, fractured a rib, and left this sort of hole in his stomach. And he was very ill, as you can imagine. And an American army surgeon called William Beaumont came to look after him. And the prognosis was not great. They didn't think he was going to survive. But after a few weeks and months even, he made an almost full recovery against the odds. Apart from the fact that he still had this hole in his stomach, which formed what's called a gastric fistula. So basically what it meant is that you could, which is a bit like a sphincter. So basically you could like depress with the finger this sphincter and then you could see a window into his gut. So William Beaumont, being an enterprising surgeon, decided that this was, quite a unique opportunity for him because Alexis St. Martin had otherwise recovered and remained in relative health other than the fact that he had this now hole in his stomach. So he decided to engage in a series of experiments on Alexis St. Martin. And he did something like over 200 experiments on him over a series of about 10 years. And then he wrote up his experiments. And they were quite rudimentary. They mostly involved tying bits of food onto a silk string and then dipping it into his stomach and then sort of pulling the string out and just seeing how digested, how much food had been digested. And then keeping tables and charts of the time and things. And he would do it with all sorts of different types of food. And one of the things he wanted to find out was how long different articles of food took to break down, mutton this much, beef this much, vegetables this much, rice, etc. And what happened after that was that lots of copycat experiments happened where people created all these charts and tables detailing how long it took down to break down different types of food. So you have this sense of things being easily digested being a good thing. And this kind of enters into the popular consciousness. And then you have a sense of age being important as well. So, the advice would be that if you're very young or if you're very old, then you should have things that are easily digested. And there was less of a focus on the sort of nutritional content as such. And it was a real recognition of the importance of how, of timely digestion, which I think is something that particularly in studies of people with things like IBS, motility is becoming, again, something that people are kind of focusing on, which I think is important and interesting. And it's just a very different way of thinking about digestion than the one that I think we tend to think of now, but also something I think maybe we should spend a little more time thinking about. Perhaps.
Yeah, so this all relates to fibre, dietary fibre, and it is inevitable that at some point we're going to mention a bit microbiota, I suppose. So now seems as good a time as any. And in answer to the original question, kind of major landmarks in our understanding of history of nutrition, I think our enhanced understanding over the past 15 years or so of the fact that we do have this universe of bacteria living inside all of us, in our guts specifically, has been a real step change in our understanding of what is important for our nutrition. And so this is something we're working on quite actively in my lab. And this is really something which is enabled by these same technologies that I was mentioning earlier, where we're able to now systematically quantify the diversity of the bacteria that live in the gut. And there's really a lot of evidence there that the activity of these bacteria is determined by dietary fibre. I mean, not everything that they do, and I'm very reticent to say there's any one way of doing anything with these very complicated things, but certainly in people, there's very good evidence that you may promote a bacteria that is more likely to keep you in good nick if you eat a high fiber diet. And of course, the higher the fiber levels there are in your diet, then that's going to have an impact on your rate of digestion. The microbiomes also relate very intimately to vitamins as well. So one of the main thing that I'm interested in my research these days is that we know that these bacteria appear to be important. We don't really know what they're doing. It appears to be some sort of nutritional role, but we don't know what these nutrients are that they are providing. And we know that all animal life, and animals are a subset of eukaryotes, which are individual and single-celled organisms. All eukaryote life evolved in a world that was already full of bacteria and had been so for billions of years before anything that vaguely resembled the cells that make up our bodies arose. And these bacteria were really the original biochemists. They were synthesizing everything that you need for animal life long before animals arrived. Bear in mind, if I was to try and map out the history of the Earth by pacing across this room, which for those online is about 10 meters across, I'd pace across it, and probably by the time my nose touched that wall, humans would have just about evolved for the time. So, bacteria have really been around for a very long time doing these things. And there is an idea that we are pursuing in my group, that the reason that we tolerate this gut full of bacteria that cause inflammation and leakiness and all these issues is that they are basically just a hotline to all of these nutrients that are really fundamental to the way that we work. The fact that this is an ancient, evolutionarily ancient influence means that we can actually understand it by looking at simple animals. So in my group, we do a lot of work in fruit flies, little things that will pop into a glass of wine in summer. And we're finding in our fly model at least signatures by completely agnostic approaches where we're trying to measure every chemical that they can produce, really important roles for B vitamins and really important roles for a group of nutrients called short chain fatty acids, which are produced in response to fermenting dietary fiber. And so there are all these connections here between what these bacteria do and things which my colleagues have just mentioned as turning points in the history of nutrition, which I think is really fascinating. And I just wanted to kind of return to the point as well about what's a real kind of milestones in our history. And obviously I take a scientist, a biologist's view of this. I think I mentioned the microbiome already. I think there's been a real appreciation over the past 30 years, and growing appreciation that not all calories are born equal, and that there is you can have an equivalent amount of calories from, say, protein or carbohydrates in your diet, and yet it will have a dramatically different influence on your health. If you get all of your calories from sugar, it's probably not going to do very much good for you. You get all of your calories from protein, nor is that going to do very much good for you. It's about really the balance of where you get your nutrients from. And I think this is really pertinent in the face of a Western diet, which is influenced by the third and final landmark of the kingdom, which is actually a kind of political, economic event, mostly in the US in the 60s, which was the sugar lobby turning up with a mountain of fructose that needed to be sold. Because, and this is a question to my colleagues here, because I'm not completely convinced I have my timeline here correct, but my kind of rough understanding of this is that basically in the post-war years, producing corn was heavily subsidized in the US. They couldn't use all of it. And so this led to a drive to use this product for something else. And corn syrup was extracted from high fructose corn syrup, which is bad for you in many ways. And yet the sugar lobby, the food industry, lobbied the US government very hard to allow them to put this into all sorts of food. I've lived in the US for a couple of years, and this is basically why bread in the US is sweet, because it's full of high fructose corn syrup. And fructose is bad for you because it basically bypasses a rate limiting step in the way that we use sugar, in a way that glucose, which is a much more commonplace sugar, is not. So we can actually control the way that we take up glucose, the way that it enters metabolism, and this happens in every single cell in the body, we can't so easily control the way that fructose is used. So there's actually an argument that even your ability to limit and control digestion or in this case metabolism actually happens at the level of a single cell, or all the cells that make up your body, in a way that is currently very, very pertinent for a global health crisis.
So one of the things you have all touched on is this idea of a clean body, clean diet, purity, and wellness culture. So I'm interested in, when did the first nutritionists start appearing? You mentioned in the 19th century before, Emilie. And also, who do we sort of trust when it comes to getting dietary advice? Because I often feel like the loudest voices are not necessarily the true ones. And obviously a lot of our perceptions are coming from social media now. So yeah, who have we been taking dietary advice from the past, and who are we taking it from now? And can we change this to improve people's health?
Yes, good question. So in terms of where do people get their knowledge about gut health from in the past? Well, they would get it from family doctors, you might imagine, and from folk wisdom passed down throughout families. But they would also get their knowledge from domestic health manuals. And as the century went on, so you have a huge explosion in print culture in the 19th century, which is one of the ways in which you get also an explosion of knowledge for people. And it's where people really start to have agency in the kinds of knowledge they have access to. So a lot of people are getting knowledge from things like periodical magazines. They're also getting their knowledge from sort of, a lot of the texts are really difficult to pinpoint in terms of the genre or authority, who's really speaking here, because there are so many people who are essentially self-publishing. There's a lot of self-help books. There's also a lot of gut health advice in places that we might think are a bit unusual, like cookbooks. So cookery, there's kind of naughty relationship between remedy and recipe. It has like a really long history, where you have another book that I was going to bring was called Every Man His Own Doctor, which is essentially a book of prescriptions you can like make at home with various ingredients you'd have around the house to treat various ailments. So there's kind of this long running relationship between medicine and food anyway, which I think is a really interesting one. But then you also get all these kinds of books that are really difficult to pin down as to where the knowledge is coming from, whether it's a medical authority or not. And one of my favorite examples is a Middle Temple barrister called Sidney Whiting published a book in 1853 called Memoirs of a Stomach. And he published it anonymously, and the conceit was that the stomach, it was a real human stomach who had written an autobiography. And I don't know how many people bought into this, but people did seem to buy into it. People ended up writing him the stomach, Mr. Stomach letters, in the same way that people wrote Sherlock Holmes letters, right? Because people thought that Arthur Conan Doyle was his pen name or his agent or something. So there are some people who are maybe suspending their disbelief. But that book, which was essentially a sort of lit narrative, the stomach talking about his life and his run-ins with alcohol, tobacco, love, marriage, old age, dished out a lot of dietetic advice. It was also obviously fictional, and it included, poetry that the stomach had written and little plays, but also prescriptions for drugs and things in there as well. And it was really difficult for the audience and the readership to make head or tail of what this book was, because it was obviously fictional, it was very entertaining, but it did have footnotes in it that referenced real medical texts or real medical lectures. And it had these prescriptions that you could actually take to the pharmacist and get made up. And it was widely well reviewed, not only for its kind of literary merit, but also for the fact that it was dishing out what people thought was actually really decent advice. And it was also kind of doing this takedown of a medical establishment that Whiting thought was too reliant on drugs, giving out too much drugs, and really we should be treating everything dietetically. So I think in the 19th century it's very, very murky. And I think the obvious parallel for us is the internet, right? where there are so many different kind of venues for us to get our dietetic knowledge from. And it's really difficult sometimes to determine the authority behind the sources that we're looking at.
Yeah, agreed, and agreed that everyone should read memoirs of the stomach because it is actually funny. Not funny, Victorian funny, actually. Yeah, I mean, agreed. I guess, in the kind of books that I look at, the self-help manuals that I look at, diet and features. It's kind of one of the kind of key components of these texts. And as I said before, by the time you get into the late 19th, early 20th century, rather, the language of nutritional science has really made its way into that dietetic literature. So you see kind of tables outlining. Well, one of the things I think is particularly interesting is the way that it's often framed in relation to work. So you do this particular kind of job, and here's the kind of diet that you should have. So if you are a kind of white-collar desk worker, you should avoid these particular foods and be looking for this kind of calorie intake per day. And the way that this information in very much kind of popular non-specialist literature is framed is around the language of protein, the language of carbohydrates. It's presented in tables that look scientific. It's presented in a way which is meant to look authoritative and meant to be legitimized through this idea of nutritional science. And I think there's one way to look at that, which would be, I think, too simple, which is to say, which would be to hold up nutritional science as being an authoritative knowledge, and to look at these self-help texts as being a kind of a misuse of that knowledge, perhaps, or an illegitimate way of using that knowledge. Whereas I think actually when you look at it closely, the story of the history of nutrition is much more complicated. It is much more about kind of co-constituting discourses. I don't think it's really possible to separate the science of nutrition from the kind of context of you mentioned household manuals, everyday wisdom, the question of what you like to eat, what you don't like to eat, what tastes good and what doesn't taste good, what you can buy, a health consumer market. I don't think it's really possible to disentangle the science and hold that up as a kind of pure discourse, and to look at everything else as a kind of muddied and just popularized version of that discourse. Yeah. As a scientist in the room, perhaps something else to say about that.
Not necessarily about history of it, but I had a question for the two of you, which is that I'm curious about how the sources of advice about nutrition might recognize variation and variety in diet as something that is important or not. And so this, on the biology side, I find this an interesting blind spot in what we do, because we contrive with these studies where we will feed an animal a given diet. Let's say we increase protein 20%, or any kind of manipulation like that, and we measure output. But invariably, we only feed them that thing. They have no real choice in what they eat because that's the only thing that they're presented with. And that gives us some information about what this thing will do on average. But of course, that's not what people do, right? We choose meals, we forage to some extent. And so really the best that we can hope for is that we can emulate a change in the average of what you might do in people. And I assume that through the course of human history, there have been times when diets are more or less varied. And so I'm just wondering whether you guys can comment on the extent to which variation and perhaps the importance of variety in diet is reflected in sources of advice.
Well, in terms of individual differences, I think what's interesting is you have two competing kind of discourses, because you have attempts at hard and fast rules at advice. So like some cookery books, for example, would tell you how to make the perfect piece of toast, right, golden brown. And it would be all about the relative absorption of butter, because it would be specifically thinking about digestibility, right? To have a really digestible piece of toast, it has to have a particular composition of butter to toast ratio. And there would be certain rules. You never eat raw bread, so not toast, I guess. Don't drink with meals, have a certain amount of time between meals, these kinds of things. So they were dishing out this hard and fast advice. And in fact, one of the domestic health manuals I was going to read from even lays out the morning routine that you should have for healthy bowels, right? It's addressed to men because they often were addressed to men. And I'll paraphrase, but essentially it was saying, you rise early, have to make your breakfast in your dressing gown, have a cigar if you want to. And then the important thing is you need to go to the outhouse at the same time every day, and you need to sit there and open your bowels, right? And it says, you must sit there for 10 minutes. And the first day, you may not be successful. And the next day, you may not be successful. But in time, you will. And you will know that you have done your duty. So it was all about corralling the body into a sense of time that worked for you, a sense of clockwork time, right? Because remember, the 19th century is also the century in which we get standardized time for the first time. Time becomes much more important for labor expectations as well. So it's a sense that we can rule our own body. So you do have those very rigid kind of rules for what one should and shouldn't eat. But then at the same time, you do have advice that says things like, if you can eat X, then you should, if you get on with oysters, then they can be a very nutritious thing. But recognizing that many people couldn't, and because you also have the recognition of allergy and food intolerance, you have things like advice manuals that say strawberries for some people reduce the sensation of ants walking across their tongue, right? Which seems like to me a clear reference to anaphylaxis, right? Allergy to strawberries. So you do, and then you also have a huge market of amateur experimentation where people would experiment with different kinds of food and realize that for different people different foodstuffs would or wouldn't get on with them. And I suppose we kind of still have that now, I think, in some respects. I think we've got a lot more recognition of 5 a day, blah, 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 all of these rules that are important, moderation and all things. But then some people with IBS, actually vegetables and fibre are tricky for them to digest, and there are other ways in which they need to approach this thing. Which, yeah, so just nothing really changes, does it, when you really think about it?
I guess I have kind of an answer to you, but also I want to come back on time and the gut, because it strikes me as someone who's currently trying to toilet train a toddler. But part of the training of the bowel is about kind of civilizing, right? And it's about kind of bringing, the making of a kind of civilized subject through kind of, through peristalsis. That's a very vague thought. I've also had another vague thought here, which I wrote down as you were thinking before, which will not make any sense in my notes when I read them tomorrow, but it says deep time bacteria. And I was just thinking about this, because I guess that you are kind of an evolutionary scientist, is that right? So in the 19th century, obviously is kind of the age of evolutionary theory. One of the things that starts to happen after the 1860s is dietary advice becomes increasingly framed in relation to evolutionary time. So this is one thing that vegetarian advocates use, and also those who do not believe vegetarian diet to be a healthy diet use, which is to call back to our kind of caveman selves, right? To say, look at the diet of our ancient ancestors. They lived on ... and therefore that is the kind of true diet of man. Or look at our teeth. Our teeth are not that we have teeth for chewing and grinding, not for tearing flesh. And it's increasingly to the 19th century, these kind of the language of evolution starts to kind of creep into the way that people are thinking about diet. And in that relationship, perhaps you've come across in research all done with this idea that the stomach is kind of out of time. So this idea that the modern stomach, the stomach is this kind of this vestige of an organ in the body. And that part of the problem of modernity is that the kind of speed of modern life, the way that we eat, problem of eating on the go, for example, is to eat out of time and out of step with the stomach, which is a kind of primordial vestige in the body, let's say. And I wondered, I don't know, I would love to hear more about kind of how evolutionary theory figured into the way that you think about gut bacteria. I mean, are they deep time bacteria?
I mean, I would argue that all biologists are evolutionary biologists because all biology evolves. It's just that not all biologists realize that. Maybe that's my conceit. Yeah, there's so many things I want to respond to in a clear way. Okay, so how does evolutionary theory figure in the way that's
How does nutrition and how does the modern science of nutrition think about evolutionary theory in relation to the work that it does?
I'm not sure. I suppose the disclaimer has to be that I'm not a dietitian, so I wouldn't want to be issuing anything that anyone would construe as advice. I'm just pontificating largely about lies. I'm not sure that it does, actually. This is something that bothers me, really kind of motivates what I do. A lot of dietary advice is, of course, evidence-driven, but you can find completely conflicted reports in dietetic literature. And this returns me to the point I was making earlier, that I hope that by understanding how the biology of nutrition evolved, and therefore how our biology as humans evolved, we can start to generate rational expectations and predictions of what would actually be a good diet. And so, you mentioned dentition, which was something that was on my mind before you mentioned it. There's a Netflix documentary called, I think it's called I forget what it's called, but it's about a simple plant-based diet. And there's this fabulous moment in it with Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of grinning, going, "Look at my teeth. No, I'm not a carnivore." And he's very strongly advocating that. He's an interesting case, actually, because obviously he's gone from being Mr. Universe and pounding about 30 eggs a day to now advocating for very much a vegan diet. And he says that he does great. I suspect he probably does. And so, we can learn a lot by thinking about what our physiology really evolved in, and I think that generates pretty good expectations of what we should or should not be eating. We've somewhat skirted around the subject of meat, because invariably in these discussions people try to get me to say, yes, I think you should be a vegetarian, and again, I'm not going to make recommendations, but there is, I think, the example of dentition that is an interesting example of how we can maybe define some maxims of what might be a healthier diet than what we have, because we don't have canine teeth in the same way that my dog does, for example. He's a carnivore, not that he gets more meat. That's something else that we've learned about. So yeah, I think there is a lot to be learned, and I think there's a long road to really doing so. And I want to return to this idea about biological rhythms as well that you mentioned, because this is a whole topic right now, in a way that I don't think we understand almost at all. That we know that we have an intrinsic circadian clock. Right? There are genes in your brain, and these are ancient genes, by the way. So you'll find these genes doing pretty much the same thing. The flies that I work with, my last common ancestor was about 300 million years ago, and they are expressed in a very periodical way throughout the day. You basically have an internal clock. And I find this idea that some of the diseases of modernity, the maladies that we see in modern life, resulting from a decoupling of our kind of internal biological rhythm from what we're actually doing throughout the day, to be really fascinating. And it does seem that there's actually biology in this as well. Intermittent fasting is another interesting example that I think might be relating.
there's biology in this as well. You know, so this, for those who are not familiar with the idea, this is the idea that if you fast, so one that seems to have reports of good effects in terms of where people feel is the 5-2 diet, and so this is where you basically fast 2 days a week. There's biology in this as well, it seems, because you can do something roughly analogous in the flies that we work on, and you actually see an extension of healthy lifespan. So this is not something which is peculiar to humans. And I think this relates very much to the question about how we think about evolution. We're finding here that something that originated in people, you know, this 5-2 diet, people reporting that you feel great afterwards, is actually something we can study in something that last had a common ancestor with us in the Cambrian. So again, there's something quite profound that happened in deep evolutionary time that influences the way that things that seem to work in humans actually function.
And sorry to interrupt you, we are running out of time. So if anyone in the room would be thinking about questions and online as well. And if anyone on the panel has any final thoughts or questions for one another before I throw to that, speak now or forever hold your peace.
I would like to hear a bit more about protein. I know that this is Adam's special subject, and I'm really interested in protein, aging, etc.
Right, so you give me carte blanche to talk about one of my favourite topics, which is always dangerous, you know, the way that I've been called for waffling just a second ago. Okay, protein, it's really important. We are all large, well, we're large made of water, but you don't get very far there. Protein provides the basis for most of the molecular machinery that your body runs on. And protein is not a simple thing. It is, well, the proteins that we need in our body are composed of 20 different chemicals, individual building blocks, called amino acids. And some of these are things that you can't store and you can't synthesize. And so that means that you are entirely dependent on the way that this really fundamental thing, this really fundamental source of nutrients, you are entirely dependent on what you get from the diet to make these things. And yet, because 10 of these are essential to make the proteins in your body, let's imagine you were deficient for any single one of these. Let's imagine you were deficient for methionine, for example. That would mean that the other 9 essential amino acids are completely useless because you're lacking in one of them that you require to make all proteins. And so basically a deficiency of any of these things can be limiting, and an excess of any of them is going to lead to a production of more ammonia, more urea, and less toxin. So they're really fascinating nutrients to nerds like me. And this has really important consequences, right? Because it means that basically, the supply of these things in your diet is highly unlikely to match your actual requirements. And so I was very privileged to work with a guy called Matt Piper, who spent a very long time thinking about the quality of protein in diet, not just quantity, no, quality. And he devised a very canny way of using these flies that we work on to prove the principle that if you improve not the quantity of protein that you eat, nor its ratio to other nutrients in diet, but the quality of protein in terms of your actual requirements, that this is actually a way that you can use to promote your own health. And so what he did was to actually figure out the proportion of these amino acids in diet that you would need, and predicted it from the genome sequence of our flies, and then compare that to what we actually feed, which is largely yeast. And so the proteins that are in yeast are different to the proteins in flies. But when you very cleverly tweaked what we provided in the media to match more closely what we predicted they would require, they actually performed better. They were able to lay more eggs, and they were actually, their lifespan was less faster. They were basically constitutively longer lived. So we managed to relax this trade-off that I mentioned earlier about the relationship between early life health, which we measured in terms of producing eggs, and lifespan. Basically, they were having it all. And so the strange prediction that you would make from this is that actually the protein source which would probably best match your requirements is that which most closely resembles what you need, which sadly is probably your own species. So it's actually an expectation to have the animals would be ironically the thing that might suit best. That is socially unacceptable. So the question is, well, why do we not do that? And I think the answer is probably parasitism. that if you are prone to eating inferior species, which anyone anywhere I'd pay for, you are more likely to pick up parasites that can easily infect you. And so I think there's a really interesting relationship here between the way that immunity and infection work and the way that they actually deter you from eating the thing that might actually be an optimal food source in terms of the way that you use protein. Did that answer your question?
On that bombshell, who in the room would like to talk about something that's not cannibalism? Do we have any questions in the room? Come back.
Hiya, thank you for this talk. So I have two questions. The first one will be more of a history question. The second one will be more of a biological science question. First, the historical one. So I was wondering what is the specific element of this more secular thrust that we see in the 19th century in regards to how people think about diets. Because you also mentioned this book from the 17th century, where we have the conception of kind of humor-based dietary advice. And then, of course, also it's a very long tail. Of course, in the 16th century, 15th century, and in the Middle Ages, I don't believe that it dates back to ancient Greek beliefs, basically. And arguably, you could call these secular as well, because it was what they believed on their knowledge of science, that everything is made out of fire and earth and so on, dry and hot and cold and wet and so on. So I was wondering about that. Oh, but just a short note, I also find it fascinating how this still relates to like dietary practice we have today. For example, I recently found out that eating cheese and nuts at the end of a meal is based on like a human theory, or that we eat like grapes together with cheese. Yeah, just that question.
Take that.
That's a very good question. I guess in terms of the humors, so this is kind of an answer to your question, but what I find interesting in the history of dietary literature is our dietetic texts that are published in the 18th century. So in the 18th century, my particular favorite dietitian, a gentleman called George Cheney, who was Scottish, but moved to London to start up his own practice. And during his time in London, he ends up kind of having wine and dine all the potential new patients, and he gets kind of enormously fat and develops all these kind of ulcers all over his body and becomes kind of very unwell. And so this is his narrative, right? This is his particular self-help guru narrative. And so he decides to kind of cure himself, and he develops his own kind of a new dietary regimen, as he calls it, which involves a lot of milk, roots, vegetables, and his insistence that you confine yourself to only 1 pint of wine per day, which I think is, doable for some. But the thing that is very interesting about Cheney is the way that his advice really merges. So he has humoral theory in there. So he's very interested in foods that heat, foods that cool, the absolute importance of keeping the body in balance at all times. So you have the humors there. But then he's also working at this moment in the 18th century where this new body is emerging, right? The nervous body. So he's also very interested in the nervous system, in the ways in which there are certain foods that nourish the nerves and certain foods that put strain and stress on the nerves. So he is this kind of this really interesting figure where you see this kind of, as you described it, that kind of long tail of humoral theory kind of bashing up against a new model of the body in the 18th century. And I guess when you get into the 19th century, the humors explicitly, I think, have fallen out of favor and are no longer part of the medical lexicon. But when you look at popular self-help books, or even just the way that just generally diet is spoken about in a kind of a non-specialist way, I think humors are still present there in ideas about kind of balance, and the idea, again, to come back to what we've been discussing already, about the idea that there might be some diets that are good for some and not so good for the others. So I think I think humors are still relevant. Sure.
Cheney also famously wrote a book called The English Malady, in which he basically proposed that the English were really terrible at digesting things, And it was because we live in great and populous towns, and we have 7 preoccupations. And this is end of the 18th century. So you have this anxiety that we've lost the ability to digest properly. And this kind of rebounds again and again. We have it again in the middle of the 19th century, again at the end of the 19th century. Oh, our ancestors, you know, they could digest things properly, but we, puny modern people, we can't digest anything anymore. And you know, obviously we have that now again, and there's, I think it links into the ideological discussions we have about vegetarianism and veganism, and oh well, our ancestors ate meat and they were healthy. No, they probably weren't healthy. I mean, we don't necessarily know that at all. But I just think it's really interesting that that we still just revisiting the same kinds of ideas, and like you say, humoral medicine, and this sense of balance and interconnection again is kind of recapitulated in 19th century neurological science as well, because you have the sense that the gut is this kind of has this kind of central role within the body, and that it's connected to everything else in the body by the nerves, which people often could describe as like telegraph wires, because right, this is a very contemporaneous and new and exciting technology for people. It also allows them to talk about the gut-brain connection, which we think of as being an incredibly modern thing with microbiome studies, but it also allows them to talk about that as a two-way connection, in the same way that telegraph would be a two-way connection, which seems really different to humoral theory, doesn't it? But actually it's not, because one of the central tenets of that is the idea that if there's something wrong with any individual part of your body, there is something wrong with the whole body. And the way to treat that is not necessarily the focus on individual systems, but a multi-systems approach. But I think it's something that you advocate for a lot in your work at the moment, don't you?
Yeah, that's exactly the issue that I was talking about earlier in terms of the challenges of trying to integrate across different biological scales and trying to account for the complexity of biological systems. So I think it's very much singing from the same sheet.
Any other questions? I think the second part, we can come back to if there's not any others in the room.
I was just wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about sort of cultural transmission of kind of food processes, because I was reading an article the other day about kind of cassava, it's like a root that was in South America, and how they have this elaborate kind of cooking and sort of deconstruction process, because it can give you low toxicity if it's not eaten properly. And then when it was moved over to Africa, they didn't know how to do this. But if you would ask the people in South America like why they did it, they wouldn't be able to tell you why. I was wondering if you maybe had sort of heard of any sort of similar things where people would sort of do things but wouldn't be able to necessarily explain why.
Who's got any examples they want to talk about?
Or eating fish on Friday.
Oh, yes.
Maybe whilst Elsa has a think about it, I'll just, I mean, nothing comes to mind that's so interesting though. But what does then come to mind, I suppose, for me, is the fact that microbiome studies now is revealing the importance of dietetics in a way that was has for a long time been a preserve of non-Western cultures, and this idea of treating the body dietetically and using food as medicine is something that for a very long time in modern Western culture has been devalued in favor of pharmaceutical intervention. And I think it's so interesting that now that we have the technologies in which to couch that in ways that make sense to us, using the scientific method, and being able to produce the kind of evidence that we find convincing, we're essentially finding evidence in support of things that in other parts of the world have been intuitive practices for a really long time.
yes, I guess in relation to that point, I think there is a kind of long and I think really problematic history of Western dietary cultures absorbing, taking on board and absorbing knowledge from other cultures around food. So I'm thinking here perhaps of the great craze for yogurt, I guess, in the early part of the 20th century. And this is a very link to the gut, a link to ideas that, particular kinds of fermentation in the gut might allow one to live longer. And was very much based on, was based on very flawed studies, which seems to suggest that countries in which this particular kind of fermented yogurt was eaten, their residents, inhabitants of those countries lived a lot longer. And I guess that what irks me perhaps is not to say that we in the West cannot learn from those kind of different food practices around the world, but rather that it often becomes that in kind of taking on board or attempting to kind of learn from, what often happens rather is consumerism gets in the way, marketing gets in the way, simplification. So these ideas which are complicated, culturally situated ideas around food and food practices, when absorbed into kind of Western consumer culture, become shadows of their former selves, which often also end up kind of simplifying the kinds of other knowledge practices that are not Western by suggesting that perhaps by suggesting that they are ancient, that they are not just simply other forms of kind of knowledge production. That's my contemporary sense.
Sorry. Kombucha, yeah, kombucha. That's what I mean.
I don't think I really have an answer to the question in terms of the transmission of these things. But I do find the point about, I suppose, really hackneying of nutritional wisdom really interesting. I often think it's interesting that certain foods may arrive on the scene with this idea that this is good for you because of this. It just seems to be a gross oversimplification. Why these things, why a given food, whatever you want, is the important constituent of a given diet in a given place.
Any questions online? Again, just throw it online then.
Thank you. So we've got a few questions, but maybe only time for one. So Stephen asks, so given these new revelations about the gut, microbiomes, etc., just how much of conventional dietary wisdom is misguided, or at least grossly reductive? And what can individuals do to better understand their own body's dietary needs without pursuing those abstracted ideals?
Great question. I think you should try and fit in the online questions because the people in the room have the luxury of a little bit of extra time on this and the snack and the drinks. Who'd like to take this one?
Sounds like you need to Adam.
There are no kicks aboard this nest with this one. So just to make sure I've got the question, the question is, what advice should you follow in essence? Is that right? And is any advice correct?
How do you navigate the terrain of fitting advice? This kind of thing.
How do you navigate the terrain of conflicting advice? I don't know. That's, I suppose, really I could say that is the question that motivates what I do, but we still don't really have the information to know what is a good diet, what is not. I'd say that there is an argument that steering away from more extreme dietary changes is probably wise. There are fad diets are fads for a reason. The Atkins diet has largely fallen out of favour recently, so this was something where people were advocating for eating a very high protein, very high fat diet as a means to weight loss through production of ketone bodies. Again, it feels like this is probably an oversimplification. So I suppose if I were to offer any sort of perspective on this, is beware of oversimplification, and also be aware that what works for other people might not work for you. We're all different. We're all genetically different, our experiences are different. We're all different ages. No, pretty sure that no one would argue that the right diet for a grown adult is necessarily the right diet for a newborn, right? But they're still humans, and vice versa, of course, as well. So I think being wary of oversimplification is the only thing that I would really want to say that I'm qualified to advise.
So in answer, maybe I would kind of throw a bomb into the room and undo the work of this panel. Which is just to suggest that perhaps nutritional science is not actually the best way for us to think about diet at all. That actually perhaps there's the oversimplification of a link between diet and health, or the way that nutritional sciences frames diet as a route to health might not always be the best way of thinking about eating. And I would like to make a case for eating as pleasure, and eating as joy, and eating as community, and eating as something situated, in family, in culture, and society, and that perhaps nutritional science isn't necessarily entirely equipped to deal with kind of all of the complexities that simple everyday act throws up. Not to undo everything we just said, sorry.
I just want to jump in before passing the mic, which is to both agree profoundly and disagree completely. First of all, that I think there is, we mentioned earlier as a thought experiment, the idea if you were to live entirely on a diet consuming nothing but sugar, probably not great for you. But I'm also at the same time advocating for trying to understand the complexity of these things. I think there are averages, and certain things that you might do if you do something very extreme will probably not be good for you. If we can find a kind of middle ground and start to work around that, to personalize and tailor these things to need, interest, desire, experience, that would be probably a good rational approach in a way. I don't think nutritional science is fully embraced today. On the other hand, though, I would also absolutely agree with you that eating is the most wonderful things about being alive. Despite all my voice tonight, I've been thinking about getting about oil.
So yeah, to play, I agree with both of you. I would just say that perhaps the answer is to also think about expanding the scope of nutrition, not thinking about just in terms of physical health or a particular kind of physical health, i.e. losing weight or anti-cancer particular diets and things like that, would be to think about these connections as well with our emotional and psychological health, which is something that's really big in microbiome studies at the moment. And Alexis St. Martin, one of the things that William Beaumont noticed was that when Alexis was angry or sad, he would digest his food slower. So I think this is an age-old idea that we know that emotions or emotional and psychological health and our dietetic health and our physical health are intimately entwined, and not just in the sense of enjoying food, but actually in a really embodied way. And maybe it's something that we need to think about more when we are choosing our diet, rather than just thinking about the relative value of protein that we're ingesting.
Just because the fascinating anecdote here, which relates to also some of the things I was speaking about scientific diet and aging. There is this phenomenon of dietary restriction. Animals you moderately reduce how much they eat, they tend to live longer, they live healthier. The clinical evidence for this so far is incomplete, but there are people who practice this and choose to practice this themselves. And obviously these people who've been doing this for decades are interesting cases, but they're still anecdotes. I find it interesting that these people commonly report feeling a bit cold. And one guy who's been doing this now for decades said, well, I was hungry for the first 5 years. And for me, I think, okay, the science behind this is fascinating. And at the age of 50, we have the physiology in terms of BMI, grip strength, and so on. At 30, he was clearly aging very well. But I would wonder, I would question, is it really worth it? So yeah, I totally agree that we need to think about these things in a much more integrated way than a very reductionist approach recognizes.
Which is exactly the point of this panel. So you haven't done anything at all. Another question from online?
That's nice. So this is a question from Kristen, and she's asking, does anyone on the panel know when scientific research into nutrition first started being translated into public health recommendations? So, for example, the food pyramids, as opposed to coming from people's doctors or self-help books.
Great question. Does anyone have the answer?
Well, I have one answer, which is relates back to back to the vitamins. I think, I might be wrong, but I think the first time they started to happen in a systematic way in public health discourse is after the discovery of vitamins in the middle, between the Great Depression and the Second World War, with recommended daily allowance.
I don't have much to add other than the fact that I concur, but I think it's interesting when you start to get this kind of national regulation of children particularly, which is usually where it starts, where you get an extension of ideas about education, not just what we put into their minds, but also what we put into their bodies, and you start to have an extension of the domestic sphere into the schoolroom, which I think is really interesting. But broadly speaking, yes, I think I would concur.
Yes, also, and also the kind of the historical moment in which that those set of guidelines are introduced also speaks to, I guess, which we haven't talked about so much in this panel, but about ideas about kind of national efficiency, the national body, and the kind of link between, I guess, nutrition, health, and well, military and workforce.
Yeah, the obvious thing to think about then is the First World War and the impact that had on nutrition of the population, and huge amounts of malnutrition that followed from food rationing.
I think it's interesting to comment that one time when I'm not convinced that nutritional science is being really integrated into public health policy is actually right now. There was a report, an inquiry really commissioned to come up with a national food strategy, which was intended to link up our ability to produce food in a healthy and sustainable way. The government commissioned this report and then elected to complete it, which is a huge waste of time and deeply frustrating.
Guys, one final question online, I think, and then we're going to have to wrap up. I'm afraid everyone in the room, but we will be around afterwards.
Okay, so this is a comment and a question from Pamela. So Pamela says, I use social media to talk about nutrition. We have to balance with science, with what people want to see and what pay attention to. The idea is social media attracts people to work with me, and then I can teach them facts in a way that is applicable to their lives. It's tricky to do this well, and it's one of the reasons there is such debate between practitioners online. We have to connect with our audience in order to help them. But this lecture has inspired me not to be afraid to use more science in my communication. If I have a question, it's what do the speakers think will change in the immediate future?
Yeah, quite an open question, but thank you, Shiva.
I think this is so interesting because it often comes down to a problem of SciComm, of science communication. Is that, how do you do effective and responsible SciComm that is accessible but also nuanced? And I think this is exactly what the commentator was talking about. It's a really, really tricky, and there are ways in which you need to draw people in, but then there's also a lot of danger in these kind of simplified comments, because people are often, because of clickbait titles, people often read the titles and they don't actually then delve into the nuance. And the ways in which science gets translated into the media particularly is often problematic. So one of the things I always think of is lots of headlines saying things like, is your microbiome making you fat? Which was based on this study in mice, where they took the microbiome, the gut bacteria of a fat mouse, and transplanted it with the gut bacteria of a thin mouse. And essentially what happened is that the fat mouse lost weight, and the thin mouse gained weight, which sounds great, because wouldn't it be amazing if you could just take a pill and get a healthy microbiome? But unfortunately, the nuance there is that the effects only lasted if the previously fat now thin mouse then ate a thin mouse diet, because of course the diet is what those particular microbes thrive on. Which unfortunately is just a way of saying that there are no shortcuts. In terms of the future, this is quite a broad question. I'm not quite sure what they were driving at, but I will just use this time to say that the thing that I think is the most interesting to me in the future is the idea of personalized nutrition, precision nutrition, and micronutrition. So this is a field that's looking at the ways in which immunotherapies can be modified to be more successful by providing particular kinds of micronutrients to people taking chemotherapies, and thinking about the really important impact of the microbiome on things like how people respond to treatments. And it's one of the ways in which we can explain why people respond differently to the same medication, which I just think is fascinating.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that assessment. That's one of the main things that motivates me in my work. And I think a big driver of this, something which we cannot help but bump into, is going to be the use of big data and machine learning. No, it's buzzy, and AI is, you know, everyone thinks it's the answer to everything, but it is a truth. I think that the more and more data that is collected on populations, it is inevitable that that's going to lead to some quite fine-grained analysis of what might be a good diet for one individual, which is not to say that I'm personally a big fan of all of my data being given over to Google, but yeah, this is coming, whether we want it to or not.
Wow. At the risk of ending our conversation on a massive bummer, I think one of the things I see in our near future is a kind of growing divide between those who are able to pursue dietary ideals, which pursue what looks like a nutritious and wholesome diet, and those who are absolutely unable to. I mean, I think that we have, you know, the growing use of food banks. We have families reporting that they're unable to feed their children. And I think that if we're absolutely really convinced that there is a link between what we eat and how healthy we are, then I think that it's really essential that, you know, that we as academics and as scientists campaign for and strongly make the case for you know, for people being able to access fruit, vegetables, and healthy foods, which doesn't seem to be going that way currently. Just really bummed myself out. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Right, so I'll wrap us off. Before I do that, a small reminder to please complete your questionnaires if you haven't had the chance to do so yet. And now I'd like to move on to thank our speakers. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Emilie, Adam, and Elsa, it's been wonderful to have you. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your insight. We also have some sponsors to thank. They've been very generous, and it's thanks to them that we've been able to have not only local speakers, but also speakers from elsewhere in the UK and abroad as well. So I'd like to thank the College of Medical, Veterinary and Life Sciences, in particular Alison Caldecott and Suzanne Kendu, for sponsoring us with the Public Engagement with Research Fund Award. And I would also like to thank the Glasgow Medical Humanities Network for sponsoring us with the Early Career Foundation Award, in particular Gavin Miller, Manuel Matthias, and Christian Sark. I'd like to thank the public engagement team at the ARC for allowing us to have our events in their space, and in particular Cassie Dillon and the IT team. And naturally, a huge thank you to everyone else in the Violet Talks team, so Michael Dearwater, Cleo Dates, Edie Bowie, and Rachel Lewis. They've all put a lot of time, energy, and effort into making these events come to life, and I'm really thankful for all their contributions. Finally, thank you to all of you who have joined us both tonight in person and online and across all of our events. It's our last event. Yeah, it's been wonderful to have these discussions alongside you and to learn from and alongside you. And I've really enjoyed it, not only for all the topics that were approached and the excellent speakers that we've had, but also because the event series has really shown how delving deep into topics requires doing so from multiple perspectives. So please join me in thanking our speakers once again, and I'll see you next time.